50 doctors can't save the emperor. Then the maid spots what they missed. In the heart of ancient Rome, at the very center of the world, a heavy silence had fallen over the imperial palace. But this wasn't a peaceful silence, it was thick with dread, clinging to the marble hallways and suffocating the servants who rushed past with wide, fearful eyes. The entire empire, stretching from the baking sands of Syria to the damp forests of Britannia, was holding its breath. The reason? In the grandest bedroom of the palace, Emperor Marcus, master of the world, was dying. The air in the chamber was hot and still. For 6 days and 6 nights, the illness had gripped the emperor, draining his life with terrifying speed. The room was crowded, but not with family. Instead, it was filled with experts. 50 of the finest doctors and physicians in the Roman world had been summoned by the Senate, their carriages clogging the roads to the palace. They came from Alexandria, from Athens, from every great city of learning. These were the best minds money could buy, the most educated, the most celebrated, the most expensive. And yet, they were all completely, utterly useless. They stood in small, agitated groups, their fine silk robes rustling as they argued in hushed, angry whispers. They debated the humors endlessly. One faction insisted it was an imbalance of the blood. No, another group from Alexandria argued, pointing to the emperor's pale, clammy skin. It was clearly an excess of black bile. They theorized about miasmas, about curses, about bad air traveling from the nearby swamps. They consulted ancient, crumbling scrolls, their fingers tracing lines of text written by masters long dead. They had tried bleeding the emperor, which only made him weaker. They had tried potions of crushed pearls and rare herbs, which only made him sicker. Every new sunrise brought a new, failed theory, and the grim, shared reality that the emperor was slipping away, and not one of them knew why. At the center of this storm of useless knowledge stood Dr. Felix. He was the emperor's personal physician, a man whose arrogance was rivaled only by his reputation. Tall and severe, his face was etched with the exhaustion of a man whose authority was crumbling before his eyes. He had built his entire life on being the one who always knew the answer, and now, in the most important moment of his career, he had none. He snapped at the other doctors, his voice cutting like a sharp knife through the tense room. He called their theories foolish, their methods archaic. But the truth was, his own suggestions had been just as fruitless. He was like a general watching his finest army be defeated by an enemy he couldn't even see. He stared at the man on the bed, not with compassion, but with the fury of someone facing an unsolvable puzzle. And the puzzle itself, Emperor Marcus, lay still. Here was a man who commanded legions, whose signature could condemn 1,000 men to death or raise a city from ruins. Now he could barely lift his head. A shallow, ragged breath was the only sign he was still alive. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, were clouded with fever. He would tremble with violent, bone-rattling shudders that terrified the doctors, then fall back into a stupor, his lips pale and cracked. The doctors were entirely focused on the symptoms, the fever, the weakness, the shaking, but they were completely blind to the cause. It was into this room of suffocating heat, whispered arguments, and the mingled smell of fear and incense that the door slowly opened. It opened just a crack, not wide enough to disturb the important men inside. A young woman slipped through the opening, silent as a shadow. Her name was Julia. She was a maid. Her world was nothing like the world of these men. Her world consisted of heavy linens, wooden buckets, and stone floors. She wore a simple, coarse-spun tunic, and her hair was tied back tightly. Her job, drilled into her since the day she first entered the palace, was simple: be invisible. She was to see nothing, hear nothing, and speak to no one unless spoken to. Her presence was purely functional, like a broom or a basin. She was there to clean up what life left behind, nothing more. She kept her eyes fixed on the marble floor as she entered, carrying a heavy wooden bucket of fresh, cool water and a bundle of clean linens. The heat in the room was almost unbearable, and the air was thick with the scent of spices, old sweat, and the strange, sharp tang of the doctor's failed potions. Julia's task was straightforward: replace the soiled water basins, wipe the sweat from the floor, and leave, all without making a sound. She moved to the far corner, away from the cluster of arguing physicians. She knelt, her knees hitting the cool marble, and began her work quietly. She could hear them, their voices a droning buzz of words she didn't understand: systemic imbalance, cerebral fever, corrupted humors. They sounded like gods arguing on a mountaintop, completely disconnected from the earth below. She emptied the old basin, the water foul and murky, then refilled it with fresh water. She moved quietly toward the large, ornate table where the doctors had laid out their useless scrolls and silver instruments. Then she had to move toward the bed. A silver cup had been knocked over, spilling onto the floor near the emperor's bedside. To everyone in the room, she was invisible. Felix and his colleagues didn't even turn as she knelt just a few feet from the dying emperor. She dipped a cloth into her bucket and began to wipe the floor. And it was in that moment of silent, humble work that she froze. It wasn't a sound that stopped her. It was a smell. This wasn't the heavy smell of incense or the sour smell of sickness. It was something else, something hiding beneath those layers. As she knelt close to the floor, the scent found her. It was faint, but it was sharp and it was wrong. It was a sickly sweet smell, something almost like almonds or overripened fruit, but with a cold, metallic edge. It was a smell that didn't belong in a sick room. Her eyes darted around nervously. Where was it coming from? Not the medicines, not the floor. She lifted her head slightly, daring to look up for just a second. The doctors were still arguing, their backs to her. She let her gaze travel carefully around the room. The smell was stronger here, near the bed. But it wasn't coming from the emperor himself. It was coming from the side of the bed, from the magnificent pile of ceremonial robes that had been placed on a nearby chair. These were the robes Emperor Marcus had worn for the festival just before he fell ill. They were heavy, dyed in royal purple and woven with thick gold thread. They were beautiful, a symbol of his absolute power. And to Julia, they smelled of death. She had smelled this before, years ago in a different life. A memory flashed in her mind, a memory of her father, of a small village, of a lesson taught on a dusty road. A lesson about plants that looked beautiful but could kill. A lesson about a specific, sweet-smelling poison. Her blood ran cold. The 50 greatest doctors in the world were looking for a disease. But Julia, the invisible maid, had just found a clue that pointed to something far more sinister. You see, Julia was not just a maid. The coarse tunic she wore was a costume, a disguise forced upon her by tragedy. The scent of the poison didn't just trigger a vague memory. It unlocked a door to a life she thought was buried forever. 10 years ago, she had not been Julia the servant. She had been Julia, the beloved daughter of Emilius, the most respected healer in their distant mountain province. Her father had been nothing like the 50 men now arguing in this room. They were men of books and theories. Her father was a man of the earth. He was someone who walked the forest at dawn, who tasted the soil, who understood the secret language of leaves and roots. He didn't read about medicine in scrolls. He listened to it in the wind. He taught her that every plant had a purpose, a secret. Some existed to heal, and some existed to harm. He was a man of practical wisdom, and people came to him from hundreds of miles away, deliberately avoiding the expensive city doctors to seek his quiet, gentle care instead. He had set bones, cured fevers, and delivered babies, all with a knowledge that seemed to flow directly from the land itself. And Julia had been his shadow. From the time she could walk, she was at his side, grinding herbs, boiling poultices, and listening. Most importantly, she was learning to observe. The city doctors read books, he would tell her, his hands stained with earth, but we read the patient. Look at their skin, listen to their breath, and always trust what you smell. And she remembered the smell. It was from a lesson she would never forget. A traveler had been brought to their village, near death, shaking with the same violent tremors as the emperor. The local physician had declared it a lung fever, but her father had knelt, just as she was kneeling now, and smelled the man's breath. He had stood up, his face grim. Then he had taken Julia to a hidden part of his garden, to a plant with beautiful, delicate, star-shaped flowers. This, he had said, pointing carefully, is the mountain laurel. Beautiful, yes? But its oil, when mixed with wine and left to cure, becomes a poison so subtle that it mimics a natural illness. It's a coward's weapon. It smells like sweet almonds and old wine. Never forget the smell, Julia. It is the scent of a hidden murder. Her father had saved that traveler. He had spent 2 days forcing a dark, bitter antidote of charcoal and mossed down the man's throat until the poison finally broke its hold. That was her father, a man who saw the truth. And that truth was what had destroyed him. A few years later, the new provincial governor, a friend of Dr. Felix from his student days in Rome, had fallen ill. The governor had summoned her father, Emilius, but he also summoned the city doctors. These city doctors, just like Felix, arrived with their scrolls and their arrogance. They declared the governor had a simple imbalance of the blood. Her father, after quietly examining the room, declared the governor was being slowly poisoned through his wine. The city doctors were outraged. How dare a provincial, uneducated herbalist contradict them? It was an insult to their entire profession. So they launched an investigation, not into the poison, but into her father. They declared him a fraud, a charlatan who used peasant superstitions to endanger his patients. They had the governor's ear. They were the elite. They were the system. Her father was ruined. His clinic was burned. His name was forbidden to be spoken. He died a year later, a broken man, leaving Julia with nothing but his knowledge and a deep, burning understanding of the arrogance of men in fine robes. She had fled. She had no money, no name, no one to protect her. She had walked for months, finally arriving in Rome, a speck of dust in the vast, cruel city. The only work she could find was the most invisible work of all, a servant in the endless, cold halls of the imperial palace. She had learned to be quiet, to be invisible, to bury the brilliant, curious daughter of the healer beneath the numb obedience of a maid. She had survived by forgetting who she was, until now, kneeling on the cold marble with the sickly sweet smell of mountain laurel filling her senses, it all came rushing back. The memory of her father, the injustice, the traveler he had saved, the beautiful, deadly flower. She looked at the 50 doctors, still arguing about humors and bile. They were the same men. They wore different faces, but they were fundamentally the same men who had killed her father. They were blind. They were drowning in their own importance while murder was happening right under their noses. And she, Julia, the maid, the invisible ghost in the corner, was the only person in the room who knew the truth. Her heart was no longer just hammering. It was a war drum pounding in her chest. She had the knowledge. She knew the poison. She even knew the antidote. But she was nothing. She was a servant, a rag in the corner. If she spoke, she wouldn't just be ignored. She could be beaten or worse. She remembered the lesson her father had taught her about the poison. But she also remembered the lesson the world had taught her: be silent and survive. She looked at the emperor, his breathing now so shallow it barely moved the sheets. He would be dead by morning. She could stay silent and she would be safe. Or she could speak and she would almost certainly be destroyed. Her past and her present were at war, and the life of the emperor hung in the balance. The silence in her mind shattered. The smell of the mountain laurel, so faint and yet so absolute, was a call to arms from her father's grave. She looked at the 50 doctors, their backs to her, their voices a meaningless drone of self-importance. These were the men who had destroyed her family. And now, their ignorance was about to cost the world its emperor. She saw her father's face, his kind eyes as he taught her about the laurel. It is a coward's weapon, he had said. And in this room, the cowards weren't just the poisoners. They were the men in robes who were too blind to see. Her fear was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. But the memory of her father and the certainty of the truth was a fire that burned even hotter. She couldn't stay silent. She couldn't let them win again. To be invisible now would be to become complicit in this murder. She placed her hands on the rim of the wooden bucket and pushed herself up from the floor. The simple, physical act of standing felt like a rebellion. Her knees ached from the hard marble, but her spine was straight. She was no longer Julia the maid. She was Julia, daughter of Emilius, and she was the only person in this room who could end this nightmare. She deliberately set her bucket down. The small sound, with scraping lightly on stone, was lost in the doctor's debate. She wiped her damp, trembling hands on her coarse tunic. She looked at the cluster of men. Dr. Felix was at their center, his face a mask of frustrated authority as he unrolled yet another scroll. She had to cross what felt like an ocean of marble to reach them. Every step she took felt deafeningly loud to her, a violation of the natural order of the palace. She was a shadow stepping out of the shade, and she could feel the exposure like sun on her skin. She reached the edge of their circle. They didn't notice her. She was just part of the furniture, another piece of the room. She waited for a moment, a brief lull as one doctor finished making a point and another prepared to argue. The silence was a tiny crack, and she threw her entire life into it. Dr. Felix. Her voice came out as a small, dry whisper. It vanished instantly. No one heard. Felix was already launching into a new tirade, his finger jabbing at the scroll. Julia's heart hammered. She had to try again. She took a breath, pulling strength from the memory of her father's quiet confidence. Dr. Felix, she said, louder this time. Her voice cracked, but it was clear enough. The arguing stopped. Instantly, 50 of the most powerful medical minds in the Roman world turned as one. 50 pairs of eyes, annoyed, confused, and insulted, all landed on her. The silence that followed was heavier and more terrible than the dread that had filled the room before. It was a silence of profound, systemic shock. A servant had spoken. Dr. Felix turned his head slowly. His eyes, cold and gray, raked over her from her worn sandals to her tied-back hair. He didn't see a person. He saw a malfunction in the palace machinery. A broom that had suddenly started speaking. What? He snapped. The word wasn't a question. It was a weapon. Julia's throat was dry as sand. Every instinct screamed at her to bow, to apologize, to run. But she held her ground, her hands clenched at her sides. "Sir, forgive me," she began, her voice trembling but finding its footing. I was cleaning. By the Emperor's bed." Felix's eyes narrowed dangerously. "And I smelled something, sir. The ceremonial robes. The ones on the chair." One of the other doctors, a man from Alexandria, actually snorted with contempt. "The robes. They smell of mountain laurel." Julia pushed on, the words tumbling out faster now. My father, he was a healer. He taught me. It's a poison, a rare one. It mimics this very illness. It brings the fever, the shaking. It attacks the breath. I've seen it before." She had said it. The truth was out, laid bare on the marble floor. For a single, breathless second, there was absolute silence. Julia's heart held a spark of desperate, foolish hope. Perhaps they would see. Perhaps they would listen. Dr. Felix stared at her. His face was blank for a moment, as if he was processing a foreign language. Then, slowly, his expression curdled into one of pure, incredulous contempt. He didn't laugh. It was worse than that. He looked at her with a cold pity, as if she were a child who had just spoken complete nonsense. "Mountain laurel," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He savored the words, rolling them on his tongue to demonstrate their absurdity. "Yes, sir," Julia whispered, her hope beginning to die. "And your father," Felix continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "was a healer." He said the word healer as if it meant street rat. He turned to the other doctors, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. "Gentlemen, we stand corrected. We have been wasting our time with the texts of Hippocrates and Galen. We have the combined knowledge of the empire at our fingertips." He turned back to Julia, his smile vanishing, replaced by towering, cold rage. "And all we needed was a servant girl and her folk tales." "Sir, it's not a folk tale, it's the truth," Julia pleaded, her voice rising with desperation. "I know the smell. You just have to check the robes." "Silence," Felix roared. The word echoed off the walls like a clap of thunder, making Julia flinch as if she'd been struck. "You are a maid," he hissed, stepping so close she could smell the wine on his breath. "You are here to wipe up filth." You are not here to think. You are not here to speak. And you are certainly not here to disrupt the work of your betters with your village superstitions. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a void. It was the same void that had swallowed her father. The void of a closed, arrogant system that would rather fail than listen to an outsider. Do you have any idea, he continued, his voice low and menacing, what is at stake? The life of the emperor, the stability of Rome. And you dare to walk in here, stinking of lie, and tell me how to do my job? You speak of poisons you know nothing about, based on smells you imagine. I'm not imagining. You are dismissed, he shouted. Not just from this room, but from this duty. Go back to the kitchens. Go back to scrubbing floors. If I see your face again, I will have you arrested for treason. Am I understood? Julia stood frozen, the blood draining from her face. She felt the 50 pairs of eyes on her, no longer curious, just cold. She was a joke. She was nothing. The first rejection was complete. It was absolute. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, a tiny, jerky movement of humiliation. Get out, Felix said, his voice now flat and exhausted, as if she had tired him with her stupidity. He turned his back on her, a final, complete dismissal. Julia turned and fled. She didn't walk. She ran. She left her bucket, her cloths, everything behind. She ran down the long marble hallway, her footsteps echoing her shame. She didn't stop until she found a dark, empty supply alcove hidden behind a tapestry. She slid into the darkness, her back against the cold stone, and covered her mouth as a sob of pure rage and helplessness tore through her. She had tried. She had stepped out of the shadows and spoken the truth, and the system had slapped her back down, harder than she could have ever imagined. Her father's fate was now her own. She was the invisible girl again, but this time she was invisible with a secret that was killing the emperor. She hid in the darkness of the alcove, her back pressed against the cold, unfeeling stone. The tapestry in front of her was a thin curtain, separating her from the world that had just rejected her. She cried, but her sobs were silent, a violent shaking in her chest. The tears weren't from sadness. They were from pure, searing rage. He hadn't just dismissed her. He had mocked her. He had laughed at her father's knowledge, the only true thing she had left in the world. Felix, with his scrolls and his self-importance, was a fool. They were all fools, and they were letting the emperor die. She wiped her nose on her sleeve, the humiliation leaving a coppery taste in her mouth. Her first instinct was to obey, to run to the kitchens and lose herself in the mindless, numbing work of scrubbing pots until her hands were raw. That was the safe path. That was survival. But she didn't move. She stayed hidden in the shadows, her breathing ragged. She thought of her father's ruined name. She thought of the 50 men in that room, so convinced of their own brilliance that they would rather let a man die than listen to a servant. A stubborn, fiery resolve began to burn away her fear. She was right. She knew she was right. And if the system was this blind, this corrupt, then it was up to her to keep watching. She would not run. She would watch. Her alcove was perfectly placed. The heavy tapestry that hid her had a small, finger-width gap in the weave, a place where the threads had worn thin. It was just enough. By pressing her eye to it, she had a narrow but privileged view of the hallway right outside the emperor's chamber. The massive, ornate door to the room had been left slightly ajar, most likely by her in her panicked exit. A new guard, a stern-faced man in full armor, had been posted directly outside it. This was clearly a message that her disruption would not be tolerated again. Re-entry was impossible. She watched for what felt like an hour. Doctors came and went, their faces grim. Servants hurried by, carrying basins and linens, their eyes fixed on the floor, just as hers used to be. Then, the atmosphere in the hallway shifted. A new figure approached, and this man did not hurry. He walked with a slow, measured pace. He was not a doctor. He was dressed in a pristine, dark blue toga, the color of loyalty and sober duty. This was Lucius, the emperor's closest advisor, the man who had served him for 20 years, his most trusted friend. His face, which Julia had only ever seen from a distance, was a perfect mask of dignified grief. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the entire empire on his shoulders. He stopped in front of the guard. The soldier, who had looked at Julia with such contempt, immediately straightened his back and bowed his head respectfully. "Advisor Lucius," the guard said, his voice low. "He is no better, I am afraid." Lucius placed a comforting hand on the guard's shoulder for a moment. "We must all pray to the gods, Captain. A man's strength can only do so much. I will sit with him. Perhaps a familiar voice will comfort him in his passage." His voice was soft, heavy with a sorrow that seemed to echo in the marble hall. The guard nodded, his own expression softening, and he opened the door for the advisor. Lucius stepped inside. From her hiding spot, Julia watched as the bickering of the 50 doctors immediately ceased. They all turned, their heads bowing in respect. Even Dr. Felix, the king of his own domain, dipped his head. "Advisor Lucius, there is no change." "I know you are doing all that is humanly possible, Dr. Felix," Lucius said, his voice projecting a sense of shared, noble burden. "Your efforts are all that stand between us and chaos. I just wish to sit with my old friend, to be there in case he wakes." The performance was masterful. He radiated loyalty and compassion. He was everything Julia was not. He was trusted. He was respected. He was visible. He was the very picture of a loyal friend. The doctors, grateful for this high-status validation of their efforts, parted respectfully to let him pass. Julia watched, a dull hatred burning in her chest. She hated him simply because he was one of them, one of the elites who lived in a world of words and titles, completely disconnected from the truth she could smell. Lucius moved to the bedside, past the scrolls and silver instruments. He pulled a stool close to the bed, sat down, and took the emperor's limp hand in his own. The doctors, respectfully, gave him his space. They retreated to the far corner of the room to resume their hopeless debate in hushed tones. Lucius was now effectively alone with the dying emperor, shielded by the crowd. He leaned in close, whispering words of what sounded like comfort. "My friend," Julia could just barely hear him murmur. "My emperor, do not leave us. Rome needs you. I need you." Then he did it. Julia, her eye pressed painfully against the tapestry, had her entire world focused on that small, visible slice of the room. Lucius's hand, the one not holding the emperor's, drifted from the bed. His gaze fell upon the pile of purple and gold ceremonial robes on the chair. The very robes Julia had pointed out. With a heavy, mournful sigh, as if performing a simple, sad act of tidying, Lucius reached out to adjust them. He smoothed the thick, gold-threaded fabric. He rearranged the collar, pulling the robes slightly closer to the bed, as if to have them ready for a recovery that would never come. But Julia saw it. She saw his hand. It wasn't just smoothing the fabric. His hand had come from his waist, from a small, ornate leather pouch hidden in the folds of his toga. His movement was too precise, too deliberate. He wasn't arranging the robes. He was touching them with purpose. His thumb and forefinger, glistening with something oily, pinched the collar, the very part of the robe that would touch the emperor's neck. He ran his fingers along the inside of the collar, his thumb pressing down not in a smoothing motion, but in a wiping motion. It was an act that took no more than 3 seconds. To anyone else, it would have looked like the absent-minded gesture of a grieving friend. To Julia, it was the act of a murderer. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The oil. Its oil, when mixed with wine and left to cure. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Lucius had a vial. He had it in that pouch. He had dipped his fingers in it, or perhaps used a small cloth, and he had reapplied the poison. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't a single event. It was an ongoing assassination. That's why the emperor wasn't getting better. That's why his illness came in waves. He would rally slightly as the poison wore off, only to be plunged back into fever and tremors when his loyal friend, Lucius, came to sit by his bedside and refresh the dose. The 50 doctors weren't just blind. They were irrelevant. They were trying to cure a disease while the assassin was in the room with them, repoisoning the patient right in front of their faces. Julia's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a case of medical arrogance. This was high treason. This was a conspiracy, and the killer was the one man in Rome, besides the emperor himself, who was completely above suspicion. She was no longer just a humiliated maid. She was a witness. Lucius finished his deadly work. He gave the emperor's hand a final, loving pat and stood up, his face a perfect picture of sorrow. He turned to the doctors. "Do not give up hope," he said, his voice thick with false emotion. "I will return in the evening to sit with him again." He walked out of the chamber. He passed the guard, giving him another sad, noble nod. He walked right past the tapestry that concealed Julia. She pressed herself so far back into the cold stone she thought her heart would stop, terrified that this man, this monster, would somehow sense her presence, smell the truth on her. He passed by, his footsteps silent on the marble. Julia was left alone in the dark alcove, her mind racing. The problem had just become infinitely more complex. This was no longer about convincing Dr. Felix he was wrong. This was about accusing the most trusted man in Rome of murder and treason. And she had no proof at all, just a smell and a single damning gesture that no one else in the world would have understood. Julia's breath hitched, trapped in her throat. She pressed her back so hard against the stone she thought her ribs might crack. Treason. The word was a death knell. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't arrogance. This was a cold, calculated murder happening in slow motion. Lucius, the man who radiated sorrow and loyalty, was the killer. The 50 doctors were just his unwitting audience, his cover. She was the only person on earth who knew. The weight of that knowledge was absolute, a crushing, physical burden that stole the air from her lungs. What could she do? What possibly could she do? She was a maid. He was the emperor's most trusted friend. To speak wasn't just to be dismissed, it was to be obliterated. Her word against his? It was a gnat accusing a mountain of moving. Her mind became a vortex of panic. She had to tell someone. But who? Not Felix. Felix was the very definition of the system that protected men like Lucius. He had already proven he would rather be wrong than listen to her. She needed someone outside the medical world. Someone who dealt in action, not theories. Someone who understood threats. As if her thoughts had summoned it, a sudden, terrible sound erupted from the emperor's chamber. It wasn't a cough or a moan. It was a sharp, gasping cry, followed by the clatter of a metal tray. "He's convulsing," a voice screamed. It was one of the younger doctors. "His heart is failing," yelled another. "Get the cold water. Get the bindings. Hold him down." That was Felix, his voice stripped of its arrogance, replaced by raw, primal panic. Julia's heart stopped. The poison. The fresh dose. Lucius had only left minutes ago. It was working, and it was working fast. This was it. This was the final, fatal dose. The emperor was dying right now. There was no more time for strategy. There was no time for fear. There was only time for action. A primal, animal instinct took over. Julia exploded from the alcove, bursting through the tapestry and into the bright, open hallway. She was a blur of motion. The captain of the guard, who was standing at his post by the emperor's door, flinched, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. He saw her, the maid from before the disruption, and his face hardened into a mask of pure annoyance. "I warned you, girl," he barked, stepping to block her path. "Get back to the—" "There's no time." Julia shrieked, her voice high and ragged with terror. She did the unthinkable. She ran up to him and grabbed his arm, his thick leather and metal vambrace, with both her hands. "Please, you have to listen." The shock of a servant touching him, a high-ranking Praetorian, rooted him to the spot for a split second. "Release me," he roared, shaking her off like she was a stray dog. "He's being murdered." Julia screamed, stumbling back. The chaos from the room was growing louder. Shouts, the sound of furniture being overturned. "I told you," the captain snarled, taking a menacing step toward her. "Your fantasies of—" "It's him. It's advisor Lucius." The words hung in the air, echoing in the marble hall. They were so enormous, so impossible, that they seemed to suck all the sound from the world. The captain of the guard froze. His entire body went rigid. He didn't just stop, he ceased all movement. His face, which had been red with annoyance, went pale with a different, much colder emotion. He looked left. The hall was empty. He looked right. Empty. The only sounds were the muffled panic from the Emperor's room and Julia's own terrified, gasping breaths. He had heard her. He had understood the words. Slowly, deliberately, he moved. He was terrifyingly fast. In one stride, he closed the distance between them. He didn't just grab her arm. His gloved hand, a gauntlet of hardened leather and iron studs, clamped around her bicep like a vice. The pain was immediate, a sharp, crushing agony that stole her breath. He didn't speak. He just began to walk, dragging her with him down the hall, away from the door, away from any potential witnesses. Julia stumbled, her feet scraping on the marble, trying to keep up with his long, angry strides. He was inhumanly strong. He pulled her around a corner, into a narrower, darker service corridor, far from the main chamber. He slammed her back against the stone wall. The impact knocked the wind from her, and her head snapped back, hitting the cold marble. She cried out a small, choked sound. The captain put his face inches from hers. He was a mountain of a man, his steel helmet blotting out the light. All she could see was the fury in his eyes. He wasn't just angry. He was outraged. He was offended in a way that went beyond mere annoyance. "You," he whispered, and his whisper was more terrifying than Felix's roar. "You are insane." "No, I saw him. I saw." "Silence," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you just said? Do you know the penalty for what you just said?" He didn't wait for an answer. "You accuse Advisor Lucius, the Emperor's most loyal friend, the man who has served this empire for 20 years without a hint of scandal? You a nothing? A floor scrubber. But the robes, the oil," she sobbed, the pain in her arm unbearable. "I saw him put it on the—" That, the captain interrupted, his voice a deadly, low growl, "is treason. What you are doing is treason. Sowing chaos, accusing the Emperor's inner circle. Do you think I'm a fool like those doctors? I am a soldier. I know the law, and the law for this is death." He leaned in so close she could feel the heat of his breath. "I don't know what game you are playing. I don't know if you're a spy for a rival family or just a half-wit who's seen too many shadows. And I don't care. But you will speak of this to no one. Not to me. Not to another servant. Not to another guard. Not to the gods themselves. Because if I hear one more word of this madness," he let his threat hang in the air, "I will not warn you again. I will not have you banished. I will personally drag you to the dungeons, and I will see you thrown to the lions at the next games for treason. Am I understood?" Julia was paralyzed by terror. The physical pain, the absolute, cold certainty in his voice, it broke her. This was the second rejection. This was the wall she could not pass. Felix had attacked her credibility. The captain was threatening her life. She couldn't speak. She could only sob, nodding her head, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, sir, please." "I am not your sir," he snarled. He released his grip, shoving her so hard she slid down the wall, collapsing in a heap on the floor. "Get out of this wing of the palace. Go back to the kitchens where you belong. If I see your face again today, I will assume you have broken your silence, and I will keep my promise." He gave her one last look of pure, undiluted disgust. Then he turned, his armored footsteps heavy and final, and walked back toward his post, leaving her weeping and broken in the dark, empty corridor. She had failed. She had failed completely. She was right. She knew she was right, but her knowledge was worthless. She had accused the killer, and in doing so had only succeeded in getting herself a death sentence. The most trusted man in Rome was murdering the emperor, and the only person who knew it had just been silenced by the only man who could have stopped him. Julia lay crumpled on the cold stone floor of the service corridor, for she didn't know how long. Her entire body ached from the impact, but the pain in her arm, where the captain's iron-studded gauntlet had crushed her, was a searing, white-hot agony. It was a brutal, physical reminder of her new reality. She was no longer just invisible. She was marked. She was a hunted animal, one word away from a horrific death. The captain's threat wasn't an exaggeration. It was a simple statement of fact. A servant accusing the emperor's most trusted advisor was treason, and the punishment for treason was absolute. She wept, her sobs silent and ragged, choking her. She had been so stupid, so naive. She had thought the truth was a shield. But the truth, she now realized, was a torch, and she had just waved it in the faces of men who lived in darkness. Felix had tried to smother it with ridicule. The captain had tried to extinguish it with the threat of death. They had both, in their own way, proven that the system wasn't built to find the truth. It was built to protect itself. Her mind screamed at her. Run. Run back to the kitchens. Run and never look back. Forget the smell. Forget your father. Forget the emperor. He's a dead man. Lucius has won. Just survive. Survival. That was the only imperative left. Slowly, painfully, she used her good arm to push herself up the wall, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. The throbbing in her bicep was a sickening rhythm, a drumbeat of her own failure. She stumbled out of the dark corridor, keeping to the shadows, flinching at every distant footstep, her eyes wide with terror. Every guard she saw, every high-status servant, was now a potential executioner. She made her way down the winding stone staircases, descending from the world of marble and power to the world of steam, smoke, and noise. She burst into the main kitchens. The heat and the roar of the fires hit her like a physical blow. Here, life was normal. Dozens of servants bustled about, shouting, chopping vegetables, turning spits, laughing. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, baking bread, and spilled wine. It was a world of blissful, chaotic ignorance. A scullery maid, her face red from the steam, bumped into Julia. "Watch it," she snapped, then saw Julia's face. "What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." Julia couldn't answer. She just shook her head, stumbling over to a dark corner, her back to the wall, trying to make herself small. She watched the chaos around her, her mind reeling. She could just disappear in here. She could pick up a rag, start scrubbing a pot. She could live. All she had to do was let the emperor die. All she had to do was let her father's knowledge die with him. All she had to do was let Lucius win. She tried. She picked up a stray rag and dipped it in a bucket of greasy water. But her hands were shaking too badly. She couldn't stop seeing the captain's face, twisted with rage. She couldn't stop smelling the sweet, sickly scent of the mountain laurel. She couldn't stop hearing the smug, false sorrow in Lucius's voice. No, she couldn't do it. This wasn't just about the emperor. It wasn't just about her father. It was about the colossal injustice of it all. The arrogant fool Felix, the brutal soldier captain, the reptilian murderer Lucius, they were all part of the same monstrous machine. And she, the invisible maid, was the only grain of sand in its gears. She dropped the rag. She couldn't fight them. Not with her voice. Her voice was her death warrant. Felix had rejected her words because she was a stupid servant. The captain had threatened to kill her for those same words because they were treasonous. So she couldn't use her voice. But what if she used theirs? The idea was a tiny, desperate spark in the darkness of her mind. Felix and his men were scholars. They were arrogant, yes, but they were men of letters. They believed in the written word, in scrolls and texts. Her spoken words were worthless because they came from a worthless source. But what if the same words appeared on parchment? What if they were presented not as a folktale from a maid, but as an anonymous tip from who? An equal? A rival doctor? It was a chance. It was a sliver, a hair's breadth of a chance, but it was the only one she had left that didn't involve walking directly into the captain's blade. She had to try. She needed parchment. She needed ink. She was a kitchen servant with a death threat hanging over her head. She had access to nothing, but she knew who did. The palace steward, the man who managed all household supplies, kept an office just off the main kitchen hall. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a new terror, but one laced with purpose. She slipped out of the kitchen, her arm throbbing with agony. She moved through the service hallways, a ghost with a mission. The steward's office was, by some miracle, empty. He was likely consumed by the chaos upstairs, trying to manage the 50 doctors and their endless demands. She slipped inside. The room smelled of old wood, beeswax, and papyrus. She scanned the desk. Scrolls, lists, ledgers. She couldn't take anything large he would notice. Her eyes landed on a small, wooden box of odds and ends. In it, she found what she needed. A small, discarded scrap of parchment no bigger than her hand, and a half-used stick of black ink. She stole them. The act felt small and petty, but it was the most rebellious thing she had ever done. She was no longer just a witness. She was a conspirator. She fled again, finding a tiny, cold storage room filled with sacks of flour. It was dark and quiet. She crouched between two massive sacks, her body hidden. She laid the parchment on her knee. Her hands, covered in grime and shaking violently, could barely hold the ink stick. She wasn't a scholar. Her writing was the clumsy, rough script of a commoner. What should she write? She couldn't accuse Lucius. The note would be seen as treason and burned, its author hunted. She couldn't mention her father. Felix would laugh again. She had to appeal directly to their pride. She had to frame it as a medical puzzle they had overlooked. She dipped the ink, her hand trembling so badly the first letter was a jagged blot. She steadied her arm, her entire being focused on this one desperate act. She wrote, in her simple, unadorned letters, "It is not a fever. It is poison. The source is the ceremonial robes. The vehicle is the oil in the collar. Check the robes." She read it over. It was simple. It was direct. It was an accusation, but not of a person. It was an accusation against their incompetence. It was a challenge. Now, how to deliver it? She couldn't go back to the Emperor's wing. The captain would see her and keep his promise. She was a marked woman. She would have to find someone else, another servant, to take it. But who? Who could she trust? She remembered Lucius's parting words to the doctors. "I will return in the evening to sit with him again." The evening. It was probably mid-afternoon now. She had only hours. Hours to get this tiny, fragile piece of hope into that room, into the hands of the very men who despised her before the killer returned to finish the job. She folded the note, her hand, covered in ink and grime, closing around it. It was her last and only weapon. The small, dark storage room was suffocating. The air was thick with the dust of old flour, and Julia's heart was a frantic bird in her chest. She held the folded scrap of parchment in her grimy hand. It felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained the weight of her life, the Emperor's life, and the entire, teetering fate of Rome. She had the message, but she had no messenger. She was a prisoner, banished to the lower levels, with a death sentence hanging over her head. The captain's promise was a cold iron band around her throat, choking her. She peeked out from the storage room, back into the roaring, chaotic inferno of the kitchens. Servants rushed past, their faces red with heat and exertion. Every face was a potential danger. Who could she trust? She scanned the room, her mind racing, judging, discarding options. The head cook, a massive, sweaty man with a booming voice. He was a notorious gossip who loved to feel important. He would either shout about it or take it straight to the steward. The young scullery maids, huddled by the washing basins, they were too flighty, too terrified of authority. They would panic and betray her before they took 10 steps. The older stewards, who managed the wine and bread, they were men of rigid rules, loyal only to the hierarchy. They would see the note as a dangerous disruption. Trusting anyone was a risk as great as going herself. If her messenger was caught, they would be beaten until they gave her name. And the captain would have his excuse. She was trapped. Every minute that ticked by, the sun crept lower in the sky, and Lucius's return, with his vial of fresh poison, drew nearer. Her eyes fell on a boy. He was standing near the wine racks, his back to her, trying to balance 2 heavy jugs of wine. He was young, perhaps 14, and small for his age. His tunic wasn't the coarse weave of a kitchen servant. It was the simple, undyed linen of a medical attendant. His name was Thomas. She had seen him before. He was one of the runners, the lowest form of life in the medical hierarchy, a boy whose entire existence was to serve the 50 doctors. He fetched their wine, cleaned their bloody instruments, carried their messages, and most of all, endured their tempers. He was perfect. He was, like her, invisible. He had legitimate access to the Emperor's wing. The captain of the guard would wave him through without a second glance. But he wasn't of their world. He was a piece of equipment, just as she was. She had seen Dr. Felix himself, just yesterday, scream at the boy for being too slow with a basin of water, his voice so full of venom that Thomas had flinched and nearly dropped it. He wasn't loyal to them. He just feared them. He was another soul crushed under the same arrogant heel. She had to try. She slipped out of the storage room, her injured arm throbbing, and moved quickly, keeping to the shadows of the kitchen. She intercepted him in a narrow, cooler pantry stacked high with barrels of oil and olives. Thomas. Her voice was a low hiss. The boy jumped, startled, and spun around. The heavy wine jug sloshed, and he nearly dropped them. What? Who? He recognized her. His eyes went wide. He had probably heard the rumors, the whispers of the maid who had been thrown out of the Emperor's chamber. I need your help, Julia said, her voice intense and fast. She grabbed his thin arm with her good hand. He was trembling. I can't, he stammered, his eyes darting to the pantry door, terrified of being seen with her. I have to bring this to Dr. Felix. He's waiting. He'll have me beaten. Let him wait, Julia said, her voice fierce. Thomas, you see them. You're in that room. You know they're failing. The Emperor is dying, and they are all wrong. I don't know anything about that, the boy whispered, trying to pull his arm free. I just carry the wine. Please let me go. No. Julia held him fast. This was her only chance. I know what's wrong with him. I know why he's dying. It's not a fever. It's poison. The boy's face went white. Poison? That's treason. I can't. You don't have to say anything, she said, cutting him off. She released his arm and pressed the folded, grimy scrap of parchment into his free hand. His fingers closed on it instinctively. This is the truth. All you have to do is get it to them. Thomas looked at the note as if it were a scorpion. Me? No, I can't. They'll know it was me. They'll kill me. They will not know, Julia insisted, her eyes boring into his. You're just the wine boy. You go in. You pour the wine. They're all arguing. They won't even see you. Just find a moment when their backs are turned. Drop this on the main table, the one with all the scrolls. Let them find it. Let them think it's from one of their own. He was shaking his head, his eyes full of tears. He was just a boy, and she was asking him to risk his life. Why me? Julia's desperation made her words sharp and true. Because you're like me, Thomas. You're invisible to them. You're just the boy who carries the wine. They see your hands, not your face. You can go where I can't. Do you want to spend the rest of your life being screamed at by men like Felix? Do you want to stand there and pour wine for them while they let a good man die, because they're too proud to see the truth? She tapped the note in his hand. This is the truth. This can save him. You don't have to be a hero. You just have to be invisible. You know how to be invisible, don't you? Her words hit their mark. His terror was still there, but something else flickered in his eyes, a spark of anger, of recognition. He, too, hated them. He, too, was tired of being nothing. This was a way for his invisibility to become a weapon. He looked down at the dirty note in his hand. He looked up at Julia's face, pale and bruised, her eyes burning with a terrifying certainty. He didn't speak. He just gave one single, sharp nod. Go, Julia whispered, her knees weak with relief. Go now, and be quick. Be invisible. And, Thomas, do not fail. The boy tucked the scrap of parchment into the waistband of his tunic, beneath his belt. He picked up the wine jugs, his arm straining, and with a final, terrified glance at her, he slipped out of the pantry. Julia was alone again, in the cool, quiet darkness. She leaned back against an olive barrel, her body finally surrendering to the tremor she had been fighting. It was done. Her last arrow was fired. She had placed her life, the Emperor's life, and the secret of Lucius's treason into the trembling hands of a 14-year-old boy. She was completely, agonizingly powerless. All she could do was retreat to the shadows of the kitchen and wait. Wait for the sound of alarms, which would mean the boy was caught and she was a dead woman. Or wait for something else. She didn't even know what success would look like. She just had to wait and pray he was as invisible as she was. Julia did not return to the main kitchen. She couldn't. The roaring fires, the shouting, the mundane, noisy business of life, it all felt like a violation. She was a raw nerve, a living embodiment of secrets and terror, and the normal world was an agony to her. She found her way back to the small, dark flower storage room, the only place that felt safe, the only place that matched the cold, dark knot of fear in her stomach. She sat on a rough burlap sack, her arms wrapped around her knees, her good hand clutching her throbbing, injured arm. And she waited. The minutes stretched into eternity. Every sound in the distant hallways was a thunderclap. Every footstep, every muffled shout was the sound of discovery, the sound of her own doom. She imagined 1,000 scenarios, each one worse than the last. She saw Thomas being caught, his face pale with terror. She saw him being dragged by the captain, pointing a shaking finger at her. She saw the guards bursting into the kitchen, their swords drawn. She saw the cold, dark water of the dungeons, the roar of the crowd in the arena, the promise of the lions. She was so lost in her own terror that she almost didn't hear the footsteps approaching her hiding spot. They were light and fast. Frightened, she shrank back, pressing herself into the shadows, her heart stopping. The flour sacks rustled. The door creaked open just a crack, letting in a sliver of light. "Mistress," a small voice whispered. It was Thomas. He slipped inside, his face the color of the flour sacks, his entire body shaking so violently he could barely stand. He wasn't in chains. He wasn't guarded. He was alone. "What happened?" Julia hissed, grabbing his arm. "Thomas, what happened?" The boy couldn't speak. He just shook his head, his eyes wide and vacant with profound, echoing terror. He looked like a child who had seen a ghost. "Tell me," Julia demanded, shaking him. I did it," he stammered, his voice a reedy whisper. "I went back. The captain, he let me pass. He didn't even look at me. Just like you said." He was breathing in short, sharp gasps, reliving it. "I went in. They were all there, arguing, yelling. Dr. Felix he was so angry. I put the jugs on the table. He was yelling at another doctor. No one was looking at me. I dropped it. The note. I dropped it right on the table, right next to his hand. And I poured the wine. My hand was shaking. I spilled it. And," Julia urged, her fingers digging into his arm, "did they find it? Did they read it?" "Yes," the boy whispered. "I was backing away. Another doctor, a younger one, Cashin, he saw it. He picked it up. And he read it," Thomas said, his voice breaking. He read it aloud. Julia's heart leaped. A wild, impossible hope surged through her. "He read it? To all of them?" "Yes," Thomas said, and now tears were welling in his eyes. He read every word. "It is not a fever. It is poison. The source is the ceremonial robes." "What did they do?" Julia breathed, her hope so fierce it was painful. The boy's face crumpled. They laughed, mistress." Julia's hope shattered. "What?" "Dr. Felix," Thomas continued, his voice thick with the memory of the humiliation. He snatched it from Dr. Cashin's hand. He held it up and he called it filth. He called it kitchen gossip and peasant superstition. He said, the boy's voice cracked. He said, "What's next?" "A curse from an illiterate laundry maid." And he laughed. They all laughed. "No," Julia whispered. "No, they had to check. Even if they laughed, He burned it," Thomas cried, the tears now streaming down his face. He walked to the fireplace, and he threw it in the fire. He said he would not be distracted by filth while he was trying to work. He said that if he ever found the fool who wrote it, he would have them flogged until they couldn't stand. The third rejection. The final one. The world seemed to tilt and go dark. Julia's hand fell from Thomas's arm. She wasn't just defeated. She was annihilated. She had used her voice, and it had failed. She had used her invisibility, and it had failed. She had used the written word, the very medium they respected, and it had been turned to ash. The system wasn't just blind, it was a fortress. It was an impenetrable wall of pride, arrogance, and power, and she had just thrown her last pebble against it. And then, Thomas whispered, just as I was leaving, he said, this nonsense is finished. We will wait for advisor Lucius. He said he is returning this evening. He, at least, is a man of sense. He will know what to do. The final nail. They weren't just ignoring the truth. They were actively, eagerly, waiting for the murderer to return. They were going to ask the killer for advice. Julia stumbled back, falling against the flour sacks. A small, dry, hopeless sound escaped her throat. It was a laugh, but it had no humor in it. It was the sound of utter, absolute despair. Mistress? Thomas asked, terrified. Go, Julia said, her voice hollow. Go, Thomas. You did what I asked. You were brave. Now go and forget this. Forget me. Forget you ever saw me. Save yourself. But the Emperor is a dead man, Julia said, her voice flat. She turned her face to the rough wall, a signal that it was over. The boy, shaking, hesitated for a long moment. Then, as silently as he had come, he was gone. Julia was alone in the dark, with the smell of flour and the suffocating, absolute knowledge of her failure. She had tried to fight the system. She had failed. She had tried to fight the killer. She had failed. She had tried to save the Emperor. She had failed. She had nothing left. No more plans. No more hope. No more courage. There was only the image of Felix laughing as he burned the truth, and the chilling, echoing promise of the captain of the guard. Lucius was coming. The sun was setting, and she was just a maid in a dark room, waiting for the end of the world. She sat in the darkness, a ghost in a room full of flour sacks. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was no palace, no emperor, no doctors. There was only the cold, hard stone beneath her and the dust in the air. She was hollow. The fear was gone, replaced by a vast, cold emptiness. She had fought and she had lost. The system, a machine of pride and power, had crushed her and her truth, grinding both to dust and burning the ashes. Lucius, the smiling killer, would win. He would be welcomed back as a friend, and he would finish his work. She, Julia, would live out her life as a kitchen maid, a secret buried so deep she would one day forget it herself. The shadows in the small room grew longer. She didn't move. She had no reason to. Then, from far away, a sound. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't footsteps. It was the distant, mournful call of the bronze Bucina, the horn that signaled the end of the working day, the setting of the sun. The evening, the sound, so normal and everyday, lanced through her emptiness. The evening. He had said he would return in the evening. Lucius. The image flooded her mind, sharp and vivid. Lucius, his face a perfect mask of sorrow, walking down that marble hall. The guard bowing, the doctors parting, making way for him. His hand reaching into his toga, his oily fingers on the robes. His whisper of comfort as he murdered the man who called him friend. And then, the image of Felix waiting for him, waiting for the killer to come and offer his sentence. Something inside her snapped. The emptiness was gone, flooded by a sudden, scalding wave of pure, incandescent rage. This wasn't just an injustice. It was a mockery. It was a grotesque, monstrous lie, so perfect, so complete, that the entire world had bowed to it. The system wasn't just blind, it was actively welcoming the wolf, begging him to come and sit among the sheep. Her life was forfeit. She saw that now. The captain's threat was real. If she stayed in this room, she would live, but she would be dead. She would be a hollow shell, haunted for the rest of her days by the knowledge that she had let the lie win. If she went back up there, she would die. The captain would keep his promise. She would be killed for her disruption, for her treason. She stood up. The choice was so simple it was almost peaceful. To live as a coward, or to die as the only person who had ever told the truth. Her fear was still there, a cold sickness in her gut, but it no longer mattered. Her life was a small, worthless thing compared to the sheer, mountainous wrongness of what was happening. She would not let them win. She would not let him laugh. She had no plan. Her voice had failed. Her note had failed. Telling them was useless. She had to show them. How? How could she prove it? She couldn't grab the robes and run. She couldn't test them. She remembered her father. She remembered the lesson of the mountain laurel. It is a coward's weapon, he had said. And then he had shown her. He had put a single drop of the oil on a rag and tossed it into their cook fire. She remembered the whoosh, the sudden, violent plume of greasy, black smoke. It burns foul, he had warned. The poison hates the fire. Remember that, Julia. Fire reveals its true nature. Fire. The fireplace where Felix had burned her note. The fireplace that was still lit, warming the very room where the doctors were arguing. That would be her proof. That would be her confession. She was no longer Julia the maid. She was a weapon. She was her father's daughter. She walked out of the flower room. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked. She moved past the kitchen, her face a pale, cold mask of resolve. The servants who saw her shrank back, their eyes wide. She looked like a ghost, her tunic filthy, her hair wild, her eyes fixed on something they couldn't see. She climbed the stairs, her footsteps steady and even. She walked back into the wing of marble and power, her good arm hanging at her side, her injured arm a dull, forgotten throb. She walked down the long, magnificent hall, back toward the emperor's chamber. And there he was, the captain of the guard, still at his post. He saw her coming. His eyes, visible in the slit of his helmet, went wide with disbelief. Then, that disbelief curdled into a cold, murderous fury. He put his hand on the hilt of his sword. I warned you, he snarled, his voice a low, vicious growl. He stepped forward to block her path, his entire body tense, ready to draw his blade. Julia did not stop. She did not plead. She did not even look at him. She looked past him at the closed door of the emperor's chamber. Her voice was dead, cold, and hollow. He's in there, isn't he? You're dead, girl, the captain hissed, pulling his sword partially from its sheath. You just sealed your own. The door to the emperor's chamber was suddenly thrown open from the inside, slamming against the wall. It was not a doctor. It was Lucius. His face was a mask, not of sorrow, but of frantic, wild-eyed panic. His pristine toga was disheveled. He's gone, he shrieked, his voice high and thin. He's not breathing. Felix, he's dead. The emperor is dead. The captain froze, his hand still on his sword, his head snapping toward Lucius. That was all Julia needed. It was chaos. In that split second of universal shock, Julia moved. She didn't run around the captain. She ducked under his outstretched arm. No. Seize her, the captain roared, grabbing for her, but he was too late. She burst into the chamber. It was a scene from a nightmare. The 50 doctors were in chaos, all rushing toward the bed. Felix was already there, his ear pressed to the emperor's chest, his face white. He's dead. Lucius screamed again, following her in. That girl. She has brought a curse. He saw her. His eyes met hers. And for one split second, his mask of panic was replaced by a flash of pure, reptilian terror. He knew. Stop her, he shrieked, pointing at her. But Julia wasn't running to the bed. She wasn't running to the doctors. She was running straight to the chair by the wall. The chair that held the heavy, magnificent, purple and gold ceremonial robes. Grab her. She's mad, Felix shouted, looking up from the unmoving emperor. The captain was lunging for her. Julia grabbed the robes. They were heavy, thick with gold thread, and saturated with the sweet, deadly oil. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, a strength born of pure, absolute rage, she heaved the entire pile into her arms. Treason, the captain bellowed, drawing his sword. She turned, and she ran. Not to the door, not to the doctors. She ran straight to the massive, ornate fireplace. The fireplace that still held the glowing, orange embers of her burned, hopeless note. No, Lucius screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. With a final raw cry that was part grief, part rage, and part a final, desperate prayer to her father, Julia hurled the heavy, poisoned robes into the heart of the fire. For 1 second, nothing happened. A single, terrible, silent beat. The captain was mid-lunge. Felix was half risen from the bed. Lucius was frozen, his mouth open in a silent scream. Then, whoosh, it wasn't a fire. It was an explosion. A massive, violent plume of oily, sickening, pitch-black smoke erupted from the fireplace, blasting outward into the room. It wasn't the smoke of burning wool. It was the smoke of chemical death. And with it came the smell. The sickly sweet, almond-like stench of the mountain laurel. No longer a faint, subtle clue, but a tidal wave of toxic perfume. It filled the room instantly, a suffocating, undeniable cloud. It was the smell of murder. The doctors, the men of science, cried out. They gagged, covering their mouths and noses with their robes. Their eyes, wide with terror, watered instantly. They stumbled back, choking. The proof was no longer a servant's whisper. It wasn't a note to be burned. The proof was in their lungs. The proof was in their stinging eyes. They were choking on the very truth they had refused to see. In the chaos, Julia stood alone before the fire, her chest heaving, her hair wild. She was covered in soot. She was a figure of terrible, triumphant vindication. The room, save for the gasps and coughs, fell into a stunned, horrified silence. All eyes turned to her, and then a new sound, a sound from the bed, a faint, weak, desperate cough. The emperor, who they all thought was dead, was choking on the poison in the air. Water, Felix gasped, his eyes wide, finally understanding. He looked from the black smoke to the emperor, and then to Julia. Gods, she was right. It is poison. The silence that followed was absolute. Then all 50 doctors, all the men of power, turned as one. And they all stared at the one man in the room who was not choking. The one man who was not looking at Julia, or at the fire, or at the emperor. Lucius. He was staring at the open door, his face a mask of pure, reptilian calculation, his mask of loyalty and friendship burned away by the black, chemical smoke. He had been exposed. The room was a pandemonium of choking, gagging men. The 50 most powerful doctors in Rome, the men of science and letters, were reduced to stumbling, weeping shadows in a cloud of black, toxic smoke. The air itself was a confession, an accusation that stung their eyes and tore at their lungs. But the chaos wasn't uniform. While the doctors scrambled for the windows, clawing at the heavy curtains, 2 men remained islands of terrible clarity. The captain of the guard, his face a mask of dawning, catastrophic horror, did not cough. He stared at Lucius. He saw the man's frozen terror, the calculated, reptilian way his eyes darted to the door. He saw the guilt, now as thick and undeniable as the smoke. The captain had threatened to kill Julia for a word of treason. Now he was standing face to face with the traitor himself, a man he had protected, a man he had believed. His error was so profound, so complete, that it demanded immediate, violent correction. Guards, he bellowed, his voice a roar that cut through the panic. Seize him. Seize advisor Lucius. Lucius, his mask of friendship vaporized, lunged for the door. But the captain was a man of action, and he was fueled by a sudden, terrible shame. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his sword now fully drawn, not for Julia, but for the traitor. He slammed the hilt of his massive broadsword into the back of Lucius's head. There was a sickening crack, and the most trusted man in Rome collapsed to the marble floor, unconscious. The punitive justice was swift, brutal, and absolute. Don't just stand there, you fools, the captain roared at the panicking doctors. The antidote. She was right. She knows the antidote. Every eye, watering, red, terrified, snapped to Julia. She stood by the fire, a small, soot-covered figure, trembling in the aftermath of her impossible act. She was no longer a maid. She was no longer a ghost. She was the only authority in the room. Dr. Felix stumbled toward her, his face a ruin of tears, soot, and shattered pride. He fell to his knees. He didn't just kneel. He prostrated himself on the marble floor, a man who had lost his God, his faith, and his very identity. Please, he wept, his voice a broken, choking rasp. He wasn't speaking to a servant. He was begging a superior. Forgive me. Save him. Tell us what to do. Julia looked down at the man who had mocked her, who had burned her truth, who had threatened to have her flogged. She saw her father's face, not his anger, but his calm. We read the patient, he had said. Her voice, when it came, wasn't a shout. It was cold, clear, and steady. It was the voice of command. The fire's out, she said. Now open every window. Get the smoke out. We need air. Then, I need charcoal, as much as you can find. Burn bread, anything. Crush it to powder. And I need milk. And olive oil. Now, run. The 50 doctors, the greatest minds in the world, scrambled to obey the orders of a maid. They ran from the room, shouting for servants, for charcoal, for milk. They were no longer physicians. They were her hands. In the cleared, smoky room, Julia knelt by the emperor's bed. He was breathing. Barely. His gasps were shallow, a tiny, fragile flutter. Felix, his face streaked with black tears, knelt beside her, a terrified assistant. I thought he was dead, he whispered, his arrogance gone, replaced by a child's awe. He was, Julia said, her voice flat as she checked the emperor's pulse. The poison paralyzes the lungs. You thought he was dead. So Lucius was going to let him suffocate. My fire, the smoke, it forced his body to cough. It bought him moments. The supplies arrived, carried by a trembling Thomas, who stared at Julia as if she were a goddess. Julia didn't measure. She acted, just as her father had. She mixed the crushed charcoal with the milk, creating a thick, black slurry. Hold his head, she commanded Felix. The once great doctor obediently cradled the emperor's head in his shaking hands. Julia spooned the antidote, the simple, earthy remedy her father had taught her, into the mouth of the most powerful man in the world. Swallow, she commanded. Swallow or you die. They waited. The room was silent, save for the wind blowing through the open windows, carrying away the last whispers of the poison. The captain stood like a statue by the door, guarding the unconscious Lucius. The 50 doctors stood in a silent, humbled semicircle, their authority gone, their eyes all fixed on the girl in the dirty tunic. An hour passed, then another. The emperor's breathing deepened. The blue tint left his lips, replaced by a faint, pale pink. His eyelids flickered. Then his eyes opened. They were no longer clouded. They were sharp, confused, weak, but sharp. He looked at the ring of soot-stained doctors. He looked at the unconscious Lucius on the floor. He looked at the captain of the guard. Finally, his gaze landed on Julia, kneeling by his bed, her face covered in grime, her eyes holding his. What? He whispered, his voice a dry rasp. What has happened here? Every eye turned to Felix. This was his moment, his last chance. Dr. Felix, his fine robe stained with soot and spilled milk, did not make an excuse. He was a broken man, but in that moment he found a kernel of honor. He stood slowly and faced his emperor. I failed you, my lord, he said, his voice hollow. We all did. He pointed a shaking finger at Lucius. He was poisoning you. For weeks. And we were too blind to see it. We treated you for a fever while he was murdering you. Who? The emperor whispered, trying to sit up. Who stopped him? Felix turned. He looked at Julia. He took a deep breath, and he delivered the public, restorative justice that her soul craved. She did, my lord. His voice was clear. That maid, Julia, she tried to tell us. She knew. She recognized the poison. I called her a fool. I told her she was a stupid servant. I threatened her. I laughed at her. He looked at the fireplace. She wrote us a note, and I burned it. I burned the truth because it came from her. He turned back to Julia, and in front of the emperor and the entire medical establishment, he fell to his knees. She risked her life, a life I threatened, to save yours. She saved us all. She is no fool. I am the fool. The status flip was complete. The great doctor was on his knees. The invisible maid stood above him. The emperor stared at Julia, his gaze intense. Come here, child. Julia, trembling, stepped forward. You knew, the emperor said. He says you knew. Why? How? How did you see what 50 of my greatest minds could not? And for the first time, Julia told her story. not in a whisper, but with a clear, steady voice. My father was a healer, my lord. His name was Emilius. He was not a city doctor. He was a man of the earth. He taught me to see, not just to read. He taught me about the mountain laurel. He was ruined by men like this, men who believed their books more than their eyes. They called him a fraud and took everything from us. He died because he told the truth. She finished. The room was silent. Emperor Marcus looked at Felix, kneeling on the floor. He looked at the 50 shamed doctors. He looked at the girl who had saved his life. Captain, the emperor said, his voice gaining strength, my lord, take advisor Lucius to the deepest cell in the Mamertine. He will be tried for high treason. He then looked at Dr. Felix. Doctor, you are a fool, but you are an honest one in the end. You are stripped of your title. You will go to the library and spend the rest of your days copying the scrolls you hold so dear. You are no longer a physician. Felix bowed his head, accepting his fate. Finally, the emperor looked at Julia. He did not offer her a bag of gold. He did not offer her a fine dress. He offered her the one thing he knew she deserved, the one thing that would complete the justice. Julia, daughter of Emilius, he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. Your father's name will be restored. A decree will be sent. He will be honored as a hero of the empire, and his work will be taught in every city. Tears streamed down Julia's face, washing away the soot. And as for you, the emperor continued, a faint smile on his lips, this palace is full of men who read, but it has a severe lack of people who can see. I am in need of a new physician, one who is not afraid of the truth. He looked at the assembled doctors. You will no longer be Julia the maid. You will be Lady Julia, my imperial healer. And your first act will be to teach these 50 fools how to open their eyes. The distributive justice was complete. Her potential was restored. Her father's name was cleared. The invisible maid was now the most powerful medical voice in Rome, her authority absolute. She had not just survived. She had won.